Sarah Martinez sat quietly at the corner table of the busy military base cafeteria, picking at her salad while reading a report on her tablet. At 42, she looked like any other civilian contractor working on the base. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore plain khaki pants with a navy blue polo shirt. Nothing about her appearance suggested the incredible military career she had behind her. The lunch rush was in full swing, and the cafeteria buzzed with conversations from various service members. Sarah preferred this corner spot because it was usually quiet, away from the main traffic flow. She had been working as a security consultant for the past 2 years, helping to design new training protocols for special operations units. It was good work, meaningful work, but very different from her previous life. 3 young Marines entered the cafeteria, their uniforms crisp and their voices loud with the confidence that comes with youth and military training. Lance Corporal Danny Rodriguez was 22 and had just returned from his first deployment. Corporal Mike Stevens was 24 and considered himself a veteran after 2 tours. Private First Class Tyler Johnson was only 20 and eager to prove himself to his older teammates. The Marines grabbed their lunch trays and looked around for a place to sit. The cafeteria was packed, and most tables were full. Danny spotted Sarah sitting alone at her table for 4 and nudged his friends. "Look at that civilian taking up a whole table by herself," Danny said, pointing toward Sarah. "Probably some office worker who thinks she's too good to share." Mike laughed and cracked his knuckles. "Yeah, let's go teach her some manners about military courtesy. Civilians need to learn their place on our base." Tyler felt a bit uncomfortable but didn't want to seem weak in front of his teammates. "Maybe we should just find another table," he suggested quietly. "No way," Mike said firmly. "She needs to learn to respect the uniform." The 3 Marines walked over to Sarah's table, their boots making deliberate heavy sounds on the floor. Danny was the first to speak, his voice intentionally loud enough for other tables to hear. "Excuse me, ma'am," Danny said with fake politeness, "but this is a military base, and we need this table. You can find somewhere else to eat your rabbit food." Sarah looked up from her tablet, her expression calm and neutral. She had dealt with situations like this before, though it had been a while. Her brown eyes assessed the 3 young men standing over her, noting their posture, their aggressive stance, and the way they were trying to intimidate her. "The table is big enough for all of us," Sarah said quietly, gesturing to the 3 empty chairs. "You're welcome to sit down." Mike stepped closer, leaning over the table. "Lady, I don't think you understand. We don't want to sit with some civilian pencil pusher. We earned the right to eat in peace without having to look at office workers." Other people in the cafeteria were starting to notice the confrontation. Some service members at nearby tables turned to watch, curious about what was happening. A few looked uncomfortable with how the Marines were treating the civilian woman, but no one intervened. Sarah calmly closed her tablet and set it aside. She took a sip of her water and looked up at the 3 Marines with the same steady expression. 20 years of military service had taught her patience, but she also knew when to stand her ground. "I understand you've had a long day," Sarah said, her voice remaining level and controlled. "But I'm not moving. This table is available to everyone, and I was here first." Danny laughed harshly and looked at his friends. "Can you believe this? She thinks she can talk back to us. Maybe she doesn't realize where she is." "Listen here, lady," Mike said, raising his voice even more. "This is a Marine base, and we don't have time for entitled civilians who think they own the place. Pack up your little lunch and find somewhere else to eat." Tyler was looking increasingly uncomfortable with his friend's behavior, but he still didn't speak up. He could see other Marines and service members watching them, and he was starting to worry that this situation was getting out of hand. Sarah finished her water and stood up slowly. At 5 feet 6 inches, she wasn't particularly tall, but something in the way she moved made the 3 Marines instinctively step back. Her movements were controlled and precise, like someone who had spent years in combat situations. "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah said firmly. "And I suggest you lower your voices and show some respect." Mike's face turned red with anger. "Respect? You want us to show respect to some civilian contractor who probably never served a day in her life? Lady, You have no idea what real service looks like. You're probably just another government worker collecting a paycheck while real warriors do the fighting," Danny added, emboldened by his friend's aggressive stance. Sarah remained perfectly calm, but something flickered in her eyes. She had spent 2 decades serving her country in the most dangerous and classified missions imaginable. She had fought in places these young Marines had probably never heard of, under conditions they couldn't imagine, but she said nothing about any of that. "You need to step away from my table," Sarah said quietly. But there was steel in her voice that made Tyler take another step back. "Or what?" Mike challenged, moving even closer. "What's a civilian going to do to 3 Marines? Call security? Complain to our commanding officer?" The confrontation was drawing more attention now. Several tables of service members were watching openly, and a few were pulling out their phones to record what was happening. Some looked disapproving of the Marines' behavior, while others seemed curious to see how the situation would unfold. Sarah looked at each of the 3 young men carefully. She could see their youth, their inexperience, and their desperate need to prove themselves. She remembered being young and eager to show her strength, though she had never bullied civilians or used her military status to intimidate others. "I'm going to give you one chance to walk away and find another table," Sarah said calmly. "After that, things might get complicated for you." Danny burst out laughing. "Complicated? What's some middle-aged office worker going to do to make things complicated? Are you going to file a complaint? Write an angry email? Maybe she thinks she knows karate from watching movies," Mike added mockingly. "Sorry, lady, but real combat training beats whatever you learned in your yoga class." Several other Marines at nearby tables were now standing up, some moving closer to watch the confrontation. The atmosphere in the cafeteria was becoming tense, and it was clear that this situation was about to reach a breaking point. Sarah glanced around the room and saw all the young faces watching her. Some looked excited for a confrontation. Others appeared concerned, and a few seemed embarrassed by their fellow Marines' behavior. She made a decision that would change everything for the 3 young men standing in front of her. "Last warning," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the now nearly silent cafeteria. "Walk away now, or learn something you'll never forget." Mike stepped forward aggressively, his chest puffed out and his fists clenched. "You want to threaten Marines on our own base? Lady, you just made the biggest mistake of your boring civilian life. What happened next would become the stuff of legend on the base, talked about for years to come." Mike reached out to grab Sarah's shoulder, intending to physically move her away from the table. In his mind, he was dealing with a stubborn civilian who needed to be taught a lesson about military hierarchy and respect. He had no idea what he was about to encounter. Sarah's response was swift and precise. In one fluid movement, she caught Mike's wrist, twisted it into a controlling position, and had him face down on the table with his arm bent behind his back at an angle that made him gasp in pain. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds, and was executed with a level of skill that stunned everyone watching. "What the hell?" Danny shouted, stepping forward to help his friend. But Sarah was already moving. Without releasing Mike, she swept Danny's legs and sent him crashing to the floor. When Tyler tried to grab her from behind, she spun around and had him in a headlock before he could react. The entire cafeteria fell silent except for the sound of Mike groaning against the table and Danny scrambling to get back on his feet. Sarah controlled all 3 Marines with an ease that spoke of decades of training and real combat experience. Her movements had been so fast and efficient that many people missed exactly how she had taken control of the situation. "Now," Sarah said calmly, still holding Mike's arm and Tyler's neck in controlling positions. "Are you ready to listen, or do you want to continue this demonstration?" "Let go of me," Mike managed to gasp from his position bent over the table. "This is assault. You can't attack military personnel." "Actually," Sarah said, her voice remaining perfectly level, "you attacked me first. I'm simply defending myself using appropriate force. Would you like me to explain the legal definitions to you while you're in that position?" Danny had gotten back to his feet, but was keeping his distance now. He could see that this woman was far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. "Who are you?" he asked, his earlier bravado completely gone. "Someone who's been where you're trying to go," Sarah replied. She gradually released her holds on Mike and Tyler. allowing them to step back. Both young Marines were rubbing sore spots and looking at her with a mixture of fear and confusion. "That's impossible," Mike said, trying to recover his dignity. "You're just a civilian contractor. There's no way you have that kind of training." Sarah sat back down at her table and reopened her tablet as if nothing had happened. "Assumptions can be dangerous," she said simply. "Perhaps you should be more careful about who you choose to harass." The other service members in the cafeteria were still watching, many of them filming with their phones. Word was spreading quickly through the room that the quiet civilian woman had just taken down 3 Marines like it was nothing. Some of the older NCOs and officers were watching with knowing expressions, as if they suspected there was more to Sarah's story. Tyler, who had been the most reluctant participant in the confrontation, was staring at Sarah with growing recognition. Something about her bearing, her movements, and her calm under pressure reminded him of the special operations instructors he had encountered during advanced training. "Ma'am," Tyler said hesitantly, "were you military?" Sarah looked up at him with a slight smile. "What makes you ask that question, Marine?" "The way you moved," Tyler said. "The way you controlled the situation. That wasn't civilian self-defense training. That was military combat techniques." Mike and Danny were still trying to process what had just happened to them. They had gone from feeling completely in control to being dominated by someone they had dismissed as a weak office worker. The shift in power dynamics was so complete and so sudden that they were struggling to understand it. "It doesn't matter," Danny said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Even if she was military, she's a civilian now. She had no right to put her hands on active-duty Marines." "Actually," said a new voice from behind them, "she had every right to defend herself against 3 Marines who were attempting to physically remove her from her table." Everyone turned to see Master Sergeant Patricia Williams approaching their table. Williams was a 26-year Marine veteran who commanded respect throughout the base. She had been eating lunch with some colleagues when the confrontation began, and she had watched the entire incident unfold. "Master Sergeant," Mike said, snapping to attention despite his disheveled appearance. "This civilian attacked us without provocation." Williams raised an eyebrow. "Without provocation?" "Son, I watched the whole thing. You 3 approached her table, demanded she move, raised your voices in an intimidating manner, and then you physically reached for her. In what world is that not provocation?" Danny tried to defend their actions. "Master Sergeant, we just needed a table, and she was taking up space that could have been used by active-duty personnel." "So your solution was to bully a woman eating alone?" Williams asked, her voice carrying the authority of decades in the Corps. "Is that what the Marine Corps taught you about honor and respect?" The 3 young Marines were now facing criticism from a senior NCO, while dozens of their peers watched and recorded. The situation had gone from bad to worse for them, and they were beginning to realize that they had made a serious mistake. Sarah had been watching the interaction with interest, but she decided it was time to speak up. "Master Sergeant Williams, these Marines are young and made an error in judgment. Perhaps this can be a learning experience for everyone." Williams looked at Sarah more carefully, noting her calm demeanor and the way she had handled the situation. "And you are?" "Sarah Martinez," she replied. "I work as a security consultant here on the base." "How long were you military, Miss Martinez?" Williams asked directly. The question hung in the air. The 3 Marines who had confronted her were now paying close attention, finally beginning to understand that they might have made a much bigger mistake than they had realized. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then decided it was time for some truth. 20 years, she said simply. "What branch?" Williams pressed. "Navy," Sarah replied. "What was your specialty?" Williams continued, though something in her expression suggested she was beginning to suspect the answer. Sarah looked around the cafeteria at all the young faces watching her. She saw curiosity, respect, and in the case of the 3 Marines who had confronted her, growing horror as they began to understand who they had been dealing with. "Special operations," Sarah said quietly. "I was a Navy SEAL." The silence that followed was complete. Every person in the cafeteria was staring at Sarah with new understanding. She wasn't just a former military member. She was one of the most elite warriors in the entire U.S. military. Navy SEALs were legendary, and the idea that 3 young Marines had tried to bully a 20-year SEAL veteran was almost unbelievable. Mike's face had gone completely white. "Oh my God," he whispered. "We tried to intimidate a Navy SEAL." Danny was looking around the cafeteria at all the people staring at them, many still holding phones and recording. He realized that this incident was going to follow them for the rest of their military careers. They had just made complete fools of themselves in the most public way possible. Tyler was the first to find his voice. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. We had no idea. We made a terrible mistake." Sarah nodded acknowledgingly. "Yes, you did. But the mistake wasn't not knowing who I was. The mistake was thinking it was acceptable to treat anyone the way you treated me." Master Sergeant Williams was shaking her head in disbelief. 20 years as a SEAL, and you 3 thought you could push her around because she looked like a civilian contractor. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for the entire Marine Corps? The 3 Marines were now facing the reality that their careers could be seriously damaged by this incident. Videos of their humiliation were already spreading through social media, and word was traveling fast through the military community. They had become the Marines who got schooled by a Navy SEAL in a cafeteria, and that was not a reputation any of them wanted. Sarah looked at the 3 young Marines standing before her, their faces showing a mixture of shame, fear, and dawning respect. She could see in their eyes that they were beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake, not just in terms of who they had confronted, but in terms of their behavior as Marines. "Sit down," Sarah said, gesturing to the chairs at her table. "All 3 of you." The Marines exchanged glances, unsure whether this was a request or an order. Master Sergeant Williams nodded at them. "You heard her. Sit." Danny, Mike, and Tyler took seats at the table they had tried to force Sarah to leave just minutes earlier. The irony was not lost on anyone in the cafeteria, many of whom were still watching and recording the aftermath of the confrontation. Sarah closed her tablet and leaned back in her chair, studying the 3 young men. "How long have each of you been Marines?" she asked. 2 years, Mike answered quietly. 18 months, Danny added. 8 months, Tyler said, his voice barely audible. "And in all that time, has anyone taught you that the strength of the military comes from respect and honor, not from bullying people you perceive as weaker than you?" Sarah asked. Mike looked down at his hands. "Yes, ma'am. We know better." "Then why did you choose to act the way you did today?" Sarah pressed. "What made you think it was acceptable to intimidate a woman eating lunch alone?" The 3 Marines struggled to answer. They had been caught up in their own sense of importance and had made assumptions based on appearances. Now, faced with the reality of their actions and the consequences, they were forced to confront the truth about their behavior. "We thought we were better than you," Danny admitted reluctantly. "We saw a civilian, and we thought that meant we had the right to push you around." "We were wrong," Tyler added quickly. "Completely wrong, and not just because of who you are. We were wrong to treat anyone like that." Sarah nodded. "That's the first honest thing any of you have said today. The fact that I'm a former SEAL is irrelevant to whether your behavior was appropriate. You would have been just as wrong to treat any civilian contractor, any support staff member, or any visitor to this base the way you treated me." Master Sergeant Williams had been listening to the conversation, and she stepped forward. "Miss Martinez, these Marines need to understand that their actions today reflect not just on them, but on the entire Corps. With your permission, I'd like to make this a teaching moment for everyone here." Sarah looked around the cafeteria, noting that most of the other service members were still watching and listening. She could see young faces, eager to learn what lesson would come from this incident. "Go ahead, Master Sergeant," Sarah said. Williams turned to address not just the 3 Marines at the table, but the entire cafeteria. Her voice carried clearly across the room. "What happened here today is a perfect example of what happens when Marines let pride and assumptions guide their actions instead of honor and respect." She pointed to Mike, Danny, and Tyler. These 3 Marines made the mistake of thinking that wearing the uniform gave them the right to disrespect someone they saw as beneath them. They judged a person based on appearance and civilian status, and they acted like bullies instead of warriors. The cafeteria was completely silent now, with everyone hanging on William's words. The Marine Corps teaches us to be strong, but strength without honor is just thuggery. Williams continued. These Marines forgot that our job is to protect and serve all Americans, not to intimidate them. They forgot that respect is earned through actions, not demanded because of rank or status. Sarah decided to add her own perspective. Standing up, she addressed the room directly. I spent 20 years in the Navy SEALs, but before that, I was a young service member just like many of you. I made mistakes. I had to learn hard lessons, and I grew from those experiences. She looked directly at the three Marines. The question now is what you're going to learn from this experience. Are you going to be bitter that you were embarrassed? Are you going to blame others for your mistakes? Or are you going to use this as an opportunity to become better Marines and better people? Mike raised his hand hesitantly. Ma'am, what can we do to make this right? Sarah considered the question carefully. You can start by apologizing sincerely, not just to me, but to everyone who witnessed your behavior today. You can commit to treating every person on this base with respect, regardless of their rank, status, or appearance. And you can use your experience to teach other young Marines about the importance of honor and humility. Danny leaned forward. Miss Martinez, would you be willing to tell us about your time as a SEAL? We'd like to understand what real service looks like. Sarah smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. I think that's a conversation we can have, but not here and not now. If you're genuinely interested in learning, we can arrange a proper discussion. Tyler spoke up. We are interested. We want to be better Marines, better people. We realize now that we have a lot to learn about what it really means to serve. Master Sergeant Williams nodded approvingly. That's what I want to hear. Miss Martinez, would you be willing to speak to some of our junior Marines about leadership and service? I think your perspective would be valuable. I'd be honored, Sarah replied. But only if these three are willing to be part of the audience and help facilitate the discussion. The three Marines nodded eagerly, recognizing the opportunity to turn their mistake into something positive. As the immediate tension in the cafeteria began to ease, other service members started to approach their table. Senior NCOs and officers who had witnessed the incident wanted to meet Sarah and learn from her experience. Young Marines and sailors wanted to understand what they could learn from the situation. What had started as an ugly confrontation was transforming into an impromptu lesson about military values and the importance of respect for all people. Sarah found herself surrounded by service members of all ranks, all eager to hear her perspective on leadership, service, and the responsibilities that come with wearing the uniform. Mike, Danny, and Tyler remained at the table, listening intently to every word Sarah said. They were beginning to understand that they had been given an incredible opportunity to learn from one of the military's most elite warriors. More importantly, they were learning about the kind of people they wanted to become. As the lunch period came to an end, Sarah gathered her things and prepared to leave. The three Marines stood as she rose, showing her the respect they should have shown from the beginning. Miss Martinez, Mike said, thank you for teaching us something important today. Thank you for being willing to listen and learn, Sarah replied. That's all any of us can do. Learn from our mistakes and try to be better tomorrow than we were today. Time. As Sarah walked away from the table, the entire cafeteria watched in respectful silence. The quiet civilian contractor who had been sitting alone at lunch had revealed herself to be a warrior with 2 decades of service to her country. But more than that, she had shown the kind of grace and wisdom that comes from true strength and genuine leadership. The 3 Marines who had tried to intimidate her were left with a lesson they would never forget, and a story that would follow them throughout their careers. But instead of being a source of shame, it had become an opportunity for growth and a reminder of the values that truly matter in military service. Word of the incident spread throughout the base and beyond. But the story that emerged was not just about a Navy SEAL who put some young Marines in their place. It became a story about the importance of treating all people with respect, about the danger of making assumptions, and about the power of turning mistakes into opportunities for learning and growth. For Sarah, returning to her office that afternoon, the incident was a reminder of why she continued to serve in her new role. The young men and women in uniform needed guidance and mentorship, and she was uniquely positioned to provide both. The confrontation in the cafeteria had been unpleasant, but it had also created an opportunity to make a positive impact on the next generation of warriors. The lesson learned that day would be remembered and retold for years to come, serving as a powerful reminder that true strength comes not from the ability to intimidate others, but from the wisdom to lift them up.